Alright, so the sounds are going to be a little odd in this video. You can probably hear it a little bit in the background. That said, my voice does seem to be the main thing. I found a really great spot to sit, and I'm going to get some stock footage for later and or winter videos. But the thing is, as pleasant as the thing in front of me is, I'm actually sitting about 2 feet away from a pretty busy road. And a sidewalk, so there's going to be people walking by. But that doesn't seem to be the primary sound. Thankfully, the microphone being about 2 inches from my mouth certainly helps with being able to hear me. Alright, so just get into this. A issue came up to me recently. I hadn't realized it, but now that I do realize it, I realize how much of a fundamental issue it's gonna be. Now, I'm not entirely sure at the recording of this video if this is news or politics. News is I'm supposed to bring up a direct article, so probably politics, but you'll have yet to see. Anyways, political issue here. It's more abstract, but it's something we're dealing with right now. Alright, so I'm trying to, like, state the question or the statement or whatever within the first minute, to make these things not, you know, like 5 minutes in, I'll stumble around saying it. So instead, here we go. The problem is, it's pretty much okay for women to be sexist. I know that is a enraging statement, no matter what side you are on. Certainly one that'll get people, using their mouths, whether or not they're using it in an appropriate, normal talking voice, that is yet to be seen, but certainly a divisive thing to say. What I mean in this, and I pretty much mean it directly, is that, I guess I'll first explain, if a man is sexist, he is crucified. If a man is sexist, even you get your Billy Bob Joes in southern Louisiana, those kind of redneck, as far as it goes kind of guys, you pretty much have social ostracization from. We ostracize them. We make they're less likely to be hired. If they're working in cities, oftentimes they'll be pelted with social justice warriors, like calling their employment and basically pressuring them to fire them. It seems like nowadays, in the last few months, employers have finally started to come around to this and started to object to firing their employees. That's a pretty recent development, and it might not be permanent. Until very recently, it seemed pretty much like someone is even accused of doing something against the common mindset. Even if they're found out to not have done it later, they're basically fired as soon as their identity is figured out. And of course, as much as the internet allows for anonymity, it also allows for people to destroy said anonymity if they really want to. So their identities are almost always found. Actually, I read recently that one guy who helped like beat a virus that was creating a lot of problems for a couple of hospitals. They were like these hackers were exploiting hospitals. Apparently they tracked him down, and because he still, once they found his identity, refused to say anything to these news companies, they docked him, or DDoSed him, or whatever, which I don't know how much of a problem that is, because I think it would probably just crush every technology source thing I have, but it seemed to be a big problem for him, and if he's the kind of guy that can pull apart a virus that was, like, giving governments a problem, well, whatever. People are very against the concept of anonymity, even if it generally came to a vote of populations, we pretty much vote yes to anonymity. Maybe. Whatever, that's an ongoing debate. We'll talk about it some other time, probably in news. The whole security versus safety debate. Privacy versus security debate. Alright, so my problem here is that when a male is found to be sexist, especially in places like the city, they are just crucified. They are hung up to dry. And for good reason. If it's an honest mistake, if it's an offhand comment like, oh, you know, women are terrible drivers, I brought up this in previous videos, it's just kind of like a common joke. Nobody actually thinks women as a sex are bad drivers. But, you know, if you can't have jokes between the genders, you're not going to have very good relations besides. You have jokes with your friends, you have jokes with your enemies, it's the same. Except the difference in malice. If you can't have jokes with your friends, then you have jokes about your enemies. And that's one of the main issues here. If a man is found to be blatantly sexist, they're crucified. The problem is women aren't. Wow, 5 minutes in and I'm just now getting to talk to... Whatever, women aren't. And that's a pretty major problem. Given, you hear it once in a while where women are pretty publicly, or at least publicly to the extent of posting it on Tumblr or Reddit or whatever, being clear about their view that women are the better of the two sexes. Now, it is, I think thus far it's been forgiven, basically because there has never really been a wide-scale matriarchy. There's been a huge patriarchy, not a huge matriarchy. There's been a few clans, or a few little civilizations, and then there's some possibilities of what things were like in the pre-agriculturist days when you didn't really need to go to war, so what were big burly men except other human beings, not rulers. But anyways, it pretty much stopped in the Dark Ages, and since then it's pretty much been patriarchy until the last 200-ish years when it's been trickling out. For reference, patriarchy, of course, male-run society that's intentionally run by only men. Matriarchy is female-run society that's intentionally run by only females. So, I guess, how do I explain this? Like, you'll see it, not even always online, where women will just sometimes, of course they're a minority, but the problem is it's a minority that's not being punished and which is very vocal, in which they'll just handle other females as the predominant, the best of the two options, the two sexes. And the fact that they exist isn't a problem. The reverse exists too. The problem is we force them to be quiet most of the time. Once in a while, a rebel will stand up and we'll crucify them, which is maybe a bit extreme, I think, but certainly better than not doing anything about it, I guess, is how I can put this. The problem is, in doing nothing about it, when it's women, you effectively create the resentment. When you say, we're equal, except if you talk about the ways in which we're not equal and you're a man, you get crucified, but if you do the same thing as a woman, you just get ignored or maybe propped up even. You're going to inevitably create resentment, and you're going to create people who are saying, well, that's not fair. Why can... I don't think many people have said, why can men not be sexist, but women can? But certainly they're saying, they're certainly at least thinking, how come every time a man thinks he is in any way better than a woman, he's crucified, when women are allowed to say straight up that women are better in general, which they are. I think that, honestly, we're not going to get a sexist-free society. We're not going to get it in period, not as an entire society, but we're not going to get a sexist-free society even moderately until it's eliminated in all ends. Like, if you want to... I guess I'll say it as a ship, where this country of ours is a ship on the ocean. The ship has a rat problem, and we've decided to eliminate all the rats. The problem is, we'll say, I don't know, half the crewmen really like the rats and have decided to let them stay in their rooms. So you clean all the rats everywhere else, in all the public spaces, and in all the rooms of the men who don't like rats. But then there's still rats, and they're just breeding, and they're creating more problems. You have to kill all the rats. You have to create a society where it's not okay from any angle. In this specific situation, not in the rats thing, but in real life, people will say, like, there isn't such a historical reason to stop female sexism like there is to stop talking about a patriarchy. or about patriarchal views. But the problem is, if you don't stop a thing from all angles, you're not gonna stop it. You're just gonna make it look like you're trying to stop it, even though you're not actually doing anything about it, and it's gonna perpetuate itself. Just the fact that women can talk about how women are superior is gonna make men resentful of women. Especially, what I'm kind of worried about here is what we're gonna. I know it's kind of a common theme when people talk about these kind of issues, but I'm kind of worried about what we're making the next generation think. On the one hand, of course, there's a lot of factors that are going to screw up the next generation, and by the next generation, I mean like 20. Who's my age in like 20-something years, or 20, 30-ish years? So the next, like, solidly, completely different. They're not even like they're the people who are for instance, you can usually tell the people who are like 30, 20 are like 35 to 40, or about 30 to 40 basically, tend to generally influence the people who are 20 to 30. The really like staunch political activists, because usually by 30 to 40, people are more calmed down. They're still believing in their values, but usually the values get more extreme as time goes on, it seems. So as a result, what you have is the 20 to 30-year-olds seeing the 30 to 40-year-olds as calm, maybe a bit conservative, or maybe a bit liberal on the other side, but calm, good people who can actually get their goals accomplished. It's exactly what they will be in 10 years, but it makes them affect the next generation pretty distinctly. So what I'm saying is, when I am in my 30 to 40, when my generation, I should say, when the millennials are in their 30 to 40 time, and it's whatever's next, like I have family that's in that kind of generation, when we are the calm but still extreme enough kind of people who are trying to actively get change done rather than the screaming at people rebels, when that generation, I'm not super worried about, because I think they're going to be us just a little more, or a little less possibly, but what I'm worried about is the generation that they're going to influence. When my generation is 40 to 50, and when we're actually starting to get change done, because that's the age when you still have enough vigor to get your stuff done. You got your kids, but you're midway through life. You've got the support behind you, and you've calmed down enough. But at the same time, you still have enough vitality in you to not just want to keep things exactly as they are, which happens at like 70 to 80 in my view. To a lesser extent, 60 to 70, but 60-year-olds have a little less to lose, I think, so they're free in a different way. 70 to 80-year-olds are kind of just at the point where they just want to leave things, and they want everybody else to leave things, and unfortunately, by that point in life, people tend to have too much support behind them they're pretty much rock solid in what they want to do. Just look at places like Congress and the Supreme Court, if you want an example of what 70-year-olds can do if they have their mindset on not changing for changing times. So, well, all right, that was a crazy tangent, but I think one of the main problems here is that I am worried what is going to happen when my generation is in our 40s to 50s, what those 20 to 30-year-olds are going to be like. On the one hand, they might be so used to such an open society, because, of course, my millennials generation, we've had the internet from the get-go, but we haven't had a society that's used to the internet until our teens. It's similar to to our 30 to 40-year-olds who didn't actually get the internet until their teens, at least not wide scale and things like that. Like cell phones came at like 16, as to where now they come at 1 or 0 if the baby can hold it. The people when I'm 40 to 50 and they're 20 to 30, those guys are gonna be alive in a structure. I mean, assuming there isn't a world war by that point, or global warming doesn't suddenly become a problem for like, you know, people who don't live on islands that are 1 inch above sea level. Assuming that that our world basically stays as it is, just with the problems we're currently worrying about slightly worse. Of course, it's going to be more complicated than that. It always will be, but just assuming a simplistic scenario here, a little more simplistic than it will be, they're going to be in a situation where the internet has been the fundamental reality for years and years. My generation, my generation, the millennials, who were basically brought up with the internet, even if we didn't always have full access to it, we will be in our prime, as in our prime of adulthood. I know people like to think of prime as 20 to 30, maybe 33-ish is where they cut it off. I honestly think of prime, I shove prime up a little more. Honestly, I cut off prime at like 65. But it's not, we don't live in a society where physical superiority actually means that much. Sure, you might be considered attractive and you're in the center of society's view, you know, celebrities and all that, and you consider them and they're all, but really what matters is intellectual prime and social prime, which in my view happens somewhere from like 35-ish to 65-ish. After 65, you're still in your social prime, but your intellectual prime starts to degrade, since even if you're completely within your faculties, which I'm sure most are, at least, assuming you don't just knock back 50 beers a night, or harder stuff, even if you're in your full mental faculties, you're just inevitably behind the issues of the current day. You know the problems of 30 years ago, and you're still actively trying to fix them, but because you and your entire generation have had 30 years to do it, they're not nearly as big of a problem. There's new problems. So, you know, I kind of cut it off at 65. Wow. I really can't do anything but tangents on this series. So, the generation that will be 20 to 30 when my generation is 40 to 50, will have internet as a fundamental reality. And that will either affect them in the way that they will, they're either going to be so used to a situation where anything can be said by anyone at any time, where it's going to be, all right, no situation is going to end up in a utopia, but it's going to end up in a freedom of speech, harm principle, libertarian-esque utopia, where it has been asserted beyond a reasonable doubt that all people are effectively equal, and taking away from any individual is fundamentally wrong, because that is sort of how the internet started, and how it was for the first 10-ish years after it got created and popularized and all that. It's more or less anyone says anything and you just deal with it. They're them. If you want to, unlike real life, you literally can shut your ears off if you don't want to hear it. You go to another website, or heck, nowadays you just like block an account or a certain subject on your Facebook or Tumblr or something like that, and boom, it's gone. It doesn't exist anymore. Of course, that's creating its own problem, which is the other scenario in which people have become so divisive and so in-grouped that I think there's going to be some real fundamental issues with how to get people to work together as a society in general. Of course, neither of these scenarios are very great, because a society that basically functions on the harm principle can't really work together that quickly. On the other hand, and they can't come together for something like a war or a big national security problem. For instance, if there's a drought, I know I forgot what state it was. I think like Colorado or Wyoming or something like that, where a lot of water comes from there, and they have these weird individual water rights, which create a lot of problems, especially for places like California, which I think are just getting out of a drought. So if there's like a national drought, a society, a libertarian utopia society, which basically runs off of the harm principle, isn't really going to be able to respond, at least not at all quickly. On the other hand, the alternative society, which I see just considering this context, the context of do we force everyone to end their sexism, their bigotry, do we force unity, or do we allow unity to happen as I believe it inevitably will, but do it in a way which allows people to come to that on their own? I think if people come to it on their own, that's good, and it'll be much more hard equality. People won't be resentful of the equality. In fact, they'll see it as the natural way to do things. At least 99.9% of them. You'll still have your Amish, like the rednecks will be the new Amish, or the redneck society will change, and you'll have your little tiny sects of it, which will be seen effectively as the Amish are, as little groups to be pitied. One problem though is because that allows for such individualism, aside from the fact that it'll take a long time, and the current problems of sexism and racism and all that will continue, it'll also will continue. They'll slowly peter out rather than really being shut down really quickly. That'll create the society in which individuals cannot be forced to do things against their will. That would be seen as fundamentally flawed within that sort of society. But on the other hand, the society which does force people to stop, aside from the fact that I don't think their sexism and racism enders will be as true, they won't be as fundamental and accepted by the people who live within their societies. It's also that they are going to have some pretty major issues with citizenry being, I guess, invigorated. If there is a drought, sure, they'll be able to allocate resources. On the other hand, if there's something which requires individual greatness, they're not going to be able to actively work on it as easily. That harm principle society would have a lot of problems in a drought situation. On the other hand, if there's another arms race, or if there's another space race or something like that, which requires individual creativity and ingenuity, they will excel. Because that's effectively what America was right after World War II. Setting aside the fact that for World War II and about 5, 6, 10 years after that, we were effectively a socialist country. Right after that, we were very, very libertarian in a hurry, and then it kind of petered out. But that's why people praise the late 50s and 60s when they do. Of course, the 60s resulted in another change, and that sort of gentled out or calmed down the libertarian craze. Anyways, the problem is that the libertarian society can't handle the drought, and on the other hand, where the individual, I guess, I don't want to call it liberal, because at one point the harm principle was the liberal side. The libertarians were the liberals, but the everybody must, okay, the pseudo-Marxists, I guess I almost want to call them the neo-pseudo-Marxists, but that's a bit of a mouthful, so we'll call them the pseudo-Marxists, would be on their society would easily be able to respond to a drought because they can just take the resources as needed. On the other hand, if you get that space race scenario or that arms race scenario, they can't do much about that because their citizens don't have many reasons to work together. All right, and I know how on like 8 minutes or something was when I was about to conclude this sexism bit, and I want to draw it all to a conclusion just so you understand where I was going with this, because there wasn't a pre-written plan, but I've had something in my head saying, like, telling me like this is the direction you should go, so that you can explain to people how devastating this could be if we don't handle it, or if we do handle it, where we'll be going. But I think this sexism issue, I think this is what I brought up with how women can be sexist, and it's not, if not accepted, it's basically ignored, is what I view as the root of the problem. Of course, I think sexism and racism will be the center of what causes this country to go in whatever direction it does go in. On the one hand, we could go into the direction sort of like, I know some places are basically extend their hate crime laws. They have, I forgot what country, but I remember hearing maybe one of the Scandinavian countries. Anyways, they have like a council or something which can determine as far as they can, beyond a reasonable doubt, whether or not something was said or done from a position of racism or sexism or something like that, and judging the crime based on as much context as they can. I don't know the specifics of that, whether or not it's just handled horribly, or whether or not they just did it wonderfully and they finally found a way to judge crime on context, at least in a small degree. But if we go in that direction, that's how we're going to get the society where they can just take the water as they need to and give it to the desert, give it to the people who are living in the starvation, or not in the drought. On the other hand, if we live in the harm principle society, the green lawn libertarian society, you know, the kind of thing where, anyways, I'll explain that green lawn thing another time. But if we go in the direction of not forcing people to stop racism and allowing it to happen inevitably on its own, because in case you haven't noticed, over the last half century, we really have just as a society been slowly thinking of each other as more and more equal. I mean, you know, you consider the cultural acceptance that is in society now versus, you know, visibly, I don't know, someone who's visibly culturally diverse, I guess is the term now. You know, in a society of today, you'd consider this diverse person to be someone visibly Muslim, or, you know, possibly Sikh, and being misunderstood. But someone who's visibly Muslim, but of course in a former society, it'd be someone, you know, visibly from a poorer region, the ghetto, and black. And how would America, even after the Civil Rights Acts, handle that person in just, we'll say, a middle-class suburbia coffee shop? How would those people sitting at the coffee shop on their Saturday react to that culturally diverse individual versus now? And they wouldn't actually have to break the law. They wouldn't have to have a hate crime to be visibly uncomfortable about that person. Nowadays, it's more unconscious than it was previously. And that's the unconscious, well, say what it is, racism and sexism is going to take a while to purge, but once it is, it's going to be so thoroughly gone that it may come back. It could feasibly come back, but as long as we stay as a united, diverse society, it will never leave. So unless something drastic happens and we end up splitting back into cultural groups, it'll never happen again. And that would take so long for it to happen again, even if it does. The only reason I think it happened originally, at least fundamentally, is just that people started in these culturally undiverse groups. You think about things, you think about things like African settlers, like maybe a little bit in North Europe or in South Europe, and some in the Middle East, and that's kind of it. You're not going to get, the Irish aren't going to be dealing with a problem of African settlers. On the other hand, now, a solid third of this population, which considers itself effectively extended Europe, similar to Australia, has direct blood ancestry to Africa. Anyways, so I know it seems a little odd. It's a long video, even though it could have been a short video, but what I'm saying is this issue, I believe that this issue, how we handle Whether or not we say, no, you are not allowed to be sexist no matter who you are, no matter what your gender. Or if we say, just let them, they'll inevitably come to the realization that we are all equal. It's not women or men who are better. Whichever path we take as a country, I think it's not the sole determining factor. There's going to be millions of those. But I think that it will be one of the largest and most obvious starting points for moving us into that direction. We could go into a million other directions, but I think that this issue if we follow along the path of this issue, then if we use how America will respond to this singular issue as an example, how not just North America, as I've said, but Europe to a lesser extent, they've seemed to figure it out. Like I said, with the Scandinavian hate council thing, they seem to be going more of the no, you can't be racist, you just have to not be. We're not going to give you time to figure it out. Although on the one hand, they've sort of picked. So more, Asia seems to have. I'm not really in on the current events of Asian politics, in case you couldn't tell by my accent. I'm not actually in Asia right now. So I think mainly how North America responds to this, and to I don't want to say lesser extent, but less directly impactful on the world as a culture, on the human race as a culture, how we respond to this in the coming decades will be a major fundamental issue about how we react in the next few centuries. And maybe it won't take that long. So anyways, that's worrying at best. Bit scary at worst. But I hope this video will make people consider this a little more. 30 minutes. Wow, this could have been 10. Alright, well, that went from 1 to 10 million, and I'm hoping I'm shoving it back to about 50. So, enjoy the generalized outro, whether this is politics or news.